Hello, good evening and welcome to this event on anti-Semitism on social media, hosted by the Wiener Holocaust Library. Just to say that I'm your chair for tonight, Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library. Unfortunately, my laptop is not functioning just now, which I only realised when I came to join for this event. So at the moment, I'm on my phone, which isn't ideal. Hopefully I can switch to my laptop shortly, but if the view looks a bit shaky or whatever, that's why. So anyway, I am delighted to welcome you here tonight for this event. This event partly arises because of the Wiener Holocaust Library's current exhibition on fighting anti-Semitism from Dreyfus to today. And this exhibition looks at anti-Semitism in Western Europe over the last century and more, and some of the efforts that have been made to challenge anti-Semitism in France, Britain and Germany. And so this event tonight is part of our event series for the exhibition, and the exhibition runs to the 18th of September. We're based in central London, so if you haven't had a chance to come and see the exhibition, please come along. We also have recordings of previous events in this series available on our YouTube channel, so you can have a look at those as well. So tonight's event also emerges because of the beginning of a recent collaboration between Brandeis University in Massachusetts and the Wiener Holocaust Library. So this is the first event that has been organised as a result of that sort of partnership. And a couple of our speakers tonight are joining us from Brandeis. And finally, the event emerges as a result of the publication of this really fascinating book on anti-Semitism on social media, recently published by Routledge. And we will be placing a flyer which will give you a discount if you'd like to buy the book. We'll be placing that in the chat for you to have the opportunity to buy the book in a moment. And we've got the editors of the volume, Sabine von Mering and Monika Hübscher, here with us tonight, and I'll be handing over to them in a moment. So there's a number of reasons for holding this event, and hopefully you'll find the contributions from the editors and also from authors other authors in the volume very interesting tonight. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, and you can put your questions in the chat feature. So now I'm just going to introduce all of our different speakers before handing over to Sabine von Mering. So Sabine von Mering is Professor of German and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, a core faculty member with the Environmental Studies Programme, and Director of the Centre for German and European Studies at Brandeis University. Her prior co-edited volumes include Right-Wing Radicalism Today, Perspectives from Europe and the US, Russian Jewish Emigration After the Cold War, Perspectives from Germany, Israel, Canada and the United States. Monika Hübscher is a PhD candidate at the Haifa Center for German and European Studies at the University of Haifa, Israel, and research associate at the project Anti-Semitism and Youth at the University of Duisburg, Essen, Germany. She researches and lectures on anti-Semitism, hate speech and disinformation on social media and social media literacy. Jacob Gruhl is a manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London, UK. His research focuses on the far-right Islamic extremism, hate speech, disinformation and conspiracy theories. He is a frequent commentator on German radio and broadcast. He has been invited to present his research about online hate to the German government. Armin Langer, PhD, is a visiting research scholar at the Schumann Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. He holds a PhD in sociology from the Humboldt University of Berlin and rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. He is author of 2 monographs, editor of an anthology and several articles on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, integration and migration in Europe, including The Eternal George Soros, Rise of an Anti-Semitic and Islamophobic Conspiracy Theory in Continent of Conspiracies, published by Routledge in 2021, and Dog Whistle Politics is a Strategy of the US American Alt-Right in Nationalism and Populism, published this year. So I will now hand over to Sabina and I think Monica, who are going to sort of talk about the book in general, I believe. So Sabina.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara. And I'm glad we got the audio figured out so that it all runs smoothly now. And welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you, or not see you, but know that you're there. I noticed a few familiar faces as well. Thank you for making today's event possible. I'm happy to see that we're taking the cooperation between Brandeis and the Wiener Library to the next level. And I hope very much that this will be the beginning of many more to come. And thanks also to Armin and to Jakob for joining us. I'm going to give a brief overview of the volume, and then Monica will present the chapter that she and I wrote together, which is chapter number 1. And then Armin and Jakob will each speak about their chapters. So we're giving you a triple snapshot, so to speak, of the volume today. And I really hope, since this is a Zoom meeting, I hope that we can engage in discussion with all of you, because I'm sure you have questions and maybe even have suggestions for us. So I just wanted to say at the outset that the book is really a product of the network of Centers for German and European Studies, which are supported in part by the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. There are 20 such centers worldwide, and I'm at the one at Brandeis, and Monica, as you heard, is at the one in Haifa, Israel. And that's where we met. And I was giving a talk about climate change and the radical right in Germany, and we noticed the parallels between misinformation and bias that is spread on social media about the climate crisis and about anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. And these obviously originate in some cases directly from right-wing ideology, and the Alternative für Deutschland, the party, is one such institution, but there are obviously many more questions. And in fact, when Monica began her PhD project, she discovered that there was astonishingly little serious research into this phenomenon of anti-Semitism on social media. There were a few individual studies, and some scholars had written about the proliferation of anti-Semitism on social media, or not social media, but online more broadly in the internet. But there wasn't a book on anti-Semitism on social media particularly, and seemingly not that much scholarly interest. And yet there was sort of this contradiction that when we approached people, they all said, oh yeah, this is a very timely subject. So we understood that there is a need clearly to do more work on this. And there is, of course, also the disturbing fact that the rate of anti-Semitic incidents has been consistently high, at least since the beginning of this century, and included now a number of violent incidents, as we had the murderous attacks on the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018 and at the synagogue of Halle in 2019. So there were very good reasons for us to look more closely at this phenomenon. And we asked ourselves why there isn't more research. What seems to be holding people back from studying this? And then, of course, the question is, well, how do we study this phenomenon? It was clear to us from the beginning that you need new methods, you need new tools to do this, because you're dealing with a very new phenomenon of social media platforms. And it's also clear that people who study anti-Semitism don't necessarily come to it with expertise in computers. That's not the primary focus of their interest at the beginning. And so we understand that there needs to be a lot more interdisciplinary cooperation, not only between historians and philosophers, but we actually need hate speech experts. We need cooperation with people who understand algorithms and who study social media and how they work. And so we were really happy in the end that we managed to recruit a really good mix of contributors for the volume, some of whom are established anti-Semitism scholars, some who are just starting out their careers. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of how this looks. So let me just 1 second. I know I have to move my mouse to the right place in order for this to work. Because, as you will see when you hear the case studies, this isn't a novel where one chapter follows logically on the other, but it's really more like a selection of case studies where we found people that had done the work and had researched this phenomenon. So this is the book, and our first chapter you will hear about in a moment, a snapshot on anti-Semitism on social media in 2021, really looks at at the business and the technology. And then Armin will talk about QAnon. We have a chapter on specifically about the Alternative für Deutschland, the German party, right-wing party. And you will hear from Jakob about the UK Labour Party and Facebook. And then there's also a chapter on, sorry, my computer is hiding part of my screen, on the attacks on democracy is chapter number 5. Now I have to look here. That's a troll attack. So the phenomenon of a troll attack, what that is, how do you study a troll attack on YouTube? We have a chapter by Cassie Miller from the Southern Poverty Law Foundation about the neo-Nazi network in the United States, which is very active and of course somewhat of a fringe phenomenon, but nevertheless particularly active on social media platforms, not only on the ones that you all don't know about, but also on the familiar ones like Twitter and Facebook. We have one chapter by Navras Afredi about Urdu on YouTube, anti-Semitic rhetoric in the language spoken by millions of Muslims in Southeast Asia. And this was really interesting because that had never been done. So this research is very original. We have a chapter that focuses on Attila Hildmann and his sort of process from one platform to another. We have a chapter on using a meme, an image, and really carefully dissecting how the image transports anti-Semitic messages and very, old, familiar anti-Semitic topoi. And we have a chapter on TikTok, which is, of course, a very fast-growing new platform used predominantly by very young users. So it's particularly disturbing to see anti-Semitism on TikTok. And then we have a chapter on which includes interviews with Jewish social media users and how they actually experience anti-Semitism on social media and what they do about it, how they deal with it. And then Günther Jekeli and his team are looking at defining anti-Semitism for artificial intelligence. So if social media companies want to use artificial intelligence to discover and then delete anti-Semitism, how do they do that? How do they decide what is anti-Semitic? And how do you teach AI to recognize anti-Semitism? And then I think that was it, yes. And then there's 2 more chapters. One Ifat Barakjani and Leon Saltil from the World Jewish Congress talk about the role of civil society, where it's a lot about, you know, our efforts to push for reporting, moderating, but also governmental regulation. And then finally, Michael Bossetta places the whole thing in a broader context. So that's an overview of the whole book, and we never meant for it to be comprehensive or conclusive. On the contrary, we really wanted to launch a new research field with this book, and hopefully that inspires many young people, including maybe some of you, to study it further. And I wanted to also make sure that people are aware that we may be reproducing anti-Semitic images here, and that may trigger, and we don't want you to be silent on this. They can be hurtful, and please do feel free to express that if you feel hurt. It's unfortunately the case that this material needs to be shown, to be researched. We need to take a closer look at it, but this upsetting, of course. So without further ado, I will hand the mic to my dear colleague, Monika Hübscher.
Hi, everybody. Let me just share my PowerPoint. Yes, it is indeed being recorded. There was a question in the chat and I'm just answering it. It's recorded, yes. So I will jump right into it. Before Armin and Jakob will present the case studies, I want to talk a bit about how the business model and the technology of social media contributes to the dissemination of anti-Semitism. And I believe we are facing an unprecedented dissemination of anti-Semitism currently that really we have never seen before, and we do not have sufficient response yet. So to begin with and to understand what we are talking about, I first want to address what is social media actually. When we talk about social media in our book, we mean platforms that curate social media content through something called algorithmic selection, recommendation, and elevation. In reality, that means that all the data you and also I put on social media, and also what we see on social media, is organized by algorithms. Algorithms organize the content based on our preferences. That means from what we look at, like, and comment on social media. Some examples of this, what we define as social media, you can see here in the example, such as Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. The business model of social media is to keep you as much as possible on the platform. To firstly show you advertisement, and secondly to collect your data. And both advertisement and selling data generates revenue for social media companies. Studies show that the social media posts we engage with the most consists of outrageous content. For example, Holocaust denial. And we reward the author of such posts with our attention through liking, sharing, and commenting on it. Research also shows that the authors of social media posts get dopamine hits from reactions on their content and therefore feel encouraged to post more outrageous stuff. In science, this phenomenon is called a dopamine-driven feedback loop. Now let's look at some examples of outrageous content, which in our case is anti-Semitic content. And I want to refer to what Sabina already said. What I'm going to show now, there's no other way to put it, is really vicious garbage. And I'm also saying that for myself, because I deal with it on a daily basis, and I by no way want to normalize this for anybody, and also not for myself. So be aware. Let me talk you through the examples we have here. So this anti-Semitic construct of an Orthodox Jew is referring to the anti-Semitic meme, The Happy Merchant, which you can find all over the internet and mostly on social media. This is actually not from social media, but from the messenger Telegram, and I don't want to get into it today, but I wanted to show you this as an example. And what is particularly disturbing on this, on Telegram, on the messenger, is when you click on the sticker, if you have the right, missing the word now, if it's possible that you immediately download it to your phone, and it's always available in every app. And you see here the high numbers of people who actually looked at this picture, which is more than 19,000 people. Next to it, you see a more subtle example of anti-Semitic content on social media, which is just an emoji combination of a rat and a Star of David. Here you see something called a GIF. And as you can see, this is also about the infamous meme, The Happy Merchant, widespread on social media. Here you see from Facebook an example from the election campaign of Donald Trump, that by no means means that he posted this, but Trump supporters or even social bots. And that was a targeted campaign against Jewish journalists. And this is a female Jewish journalist from the US. This is Hadass Gold, and she got those messages 1,000 times a day for like over 3 months. Here you see a screenshot from a short video on TikTok, which Sabina already explained is pretty famous among young people, even kids. And you see 2 high school students from the US Photoshop themselves into a photo of a cattle car going towards deportation to concentration or death camps. And they wrote, "Me and my boys on the way to the camp," which is Holocaust relativation and the shocking lack of empathy towards victims of the Holocaust. Next to it, you see a tweet, which is very interesting because it's not only anti-Semitic, but it's from a verified account that is actually supposed, you see this by the blue arrow, by the white arrow in the blue thingy, which is actually supposed to suggest to users that this is a trustful source. But here you can see that this is not the case. My last example here is a pretty new one. And you see, to avoid being recognized by algorithms that try to take off anti-Semitism from social media, anti-Semitism adapts. So instead of "kill all Jews," people now just write "kill all the Jews." Now I would like to speak about another social media tool that supports the dissemination of anti-Semitism, namely recommendation algorithms. And I will first explain that without anti-Semitism in it. because this is from an official source I found, which is always good to work with. And this is about the recommendation algorithm for followers from TikTok. And you see, if I am, this basically means if I'm following a Black woman on social media, I will suggest it to follow more accounts from Black women. This same goes for blonde women, Black men, Asian men, white men with beard, and so on and on. So white men with beard is already very detailed. So this does not only count for followers, like people you can follow on social media, but also, for instance, topics you're interested in. Then if you, for instance, I will come to that now. If you, for instance, interested, this is English, in content about the Corona pandemic, you will likely, the algorithm will suggest that you will join groups or individuals that share content on this topic. So you will be most likely exposed to content where the pandemic is called a conspiracy. And you will see other people liking and commenting on this. And with that, in your mind, affirming these messages. And likely, very quickly, you will be exposed to memes or videos calling the pandemic the so-called Jew flu or Holocaust, both anti-Semitic conspiracies. And studies on YouTube's recommendation algorithm actually show how users are gradually exposed to more and more extreme content. So with this very short insight, I hope you will be interested in reading the chapter and reading the book. And I'm letting Jakob talk.
No, Armin is next.
Oh, I'm sorry. Armin, sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Monica, for introducing us to the dark side of social media and the internet. I'm going to start with speaking about probably the darkest of all social media, with 4chan. Let me just share my screen. Can you please nod if you can see my screen? Great. I like seeing nodding heads. That's a good sign. Okay, just a second. So in my chapter entitled Deep State, Child Sacrifices and the Pandemic, I'm looking at the historical background of anti-Semitic tropes within the QAnon movement. I can tell you that when I first started working on this chapter, the term online movement was still in the title, but I ended up throwing it out because, as you'll soon find out, this movement, which started as an online collective, within a few years turned out to be also in person and on the streets. And after the January 6th Capitol attack, we know that they can be very much on the streets, but that's not where the story of the movement begins. My chapter in the book first introduces the reader to QAnon. Furthermore, it identifies the elements, the main narrative of QAnon, and also shows how these elements reproduce anti-Semitic codes. In the chapter, I also give the historical background to these tropes. I believe that by creating this link between the historical anti-Semitic topoi and the contemporary narratives of QAnon, we can underline the continuity of anti-Semitism from generations ago to the current world of social media. And also looking at the anti-Semitic and historical background of these narratives can help us understand why QAnon should be a no-go, and where the anti-Semitism behind the words and the codes lies. It's not always explicit, as we are gonna see in a minute. For those of you who haven't heard of QAnon yet, just very briefly, the movement or the idea first appeared in the fall of 2017 on the image board, kind of a social media, arguably social media platform called 4chan, when a user who described themselves as Q started to publish a series of comments on an alleged conspiracy by the so-called deep state against the back then US President Donald Trump. And since 2017, an endless amount of conspiracy myths and allegations have been published in the name of Q and their followers, not only in the US, but also in other parts of the world, including the UK, of course, and several other European countries. And also I wanted to mention that even though the QAnon movement or collective first appeared on 4chan, soon they became also very active on other social media platforms, especially Facebook and Twitter. Even though after the January 6 attacks on the Capitol, some of the more mainstream social media platforms did attempt to censor QAnon content, and to some degree, they were also successful. But as Monica mentioned in her presentation, initially the social media platforms did not really take the QAnon movement seriously. They were more interested in profit and clicks, I guess. Now, in the following few minutes, I will just give you a few examples of QAnon narratives and show how these narratives, how these core ideas that form part of the QAnon identity reproduce historic anti-Semitic codes. I would argue that the very basic and initial QAnon story of a deep state, of a conspiracy against Donald Trump, already works with historical anti-Semitic conspiracy myths that we can find, for instance, in the 19th century protocols of the Elders of Zion, or the early 20th century, the International Jew. As you know, these traditional anti-Semitic sources do allege that there is a Jewish conspiracy against traditional values, against Christianity, against the defenders of these traditional values. And QAnon does suggest a similar conspiracy against Donald Trump, against Boris Johnson, even in a UK context. Very often, followers of QAnon who call themselves Anons will make a connection between the deep state and certain Jewish figures or figures perceived as Jews. I brought to you a screenshot from Twitter where a QAnon follower makes a connection between a deep state plan and George Soros, who is a Hungarian-born Jewish businessman based in the US, and the Rockefellers, who are not Jewish to my knowledge, but are very often portrayed as Jews by anti-Semites, or the Rothschilds, et cetera, et cetera. So you can find these connections very often in QAnon content. I also want to make you aware of the term cabal, which you can see on the screenshot. Cabal is often used by Anons to describe the alleged deep state conspirators. It's a term which, by the way, derives from the Hebrew word of Kabbalah. I don't believe in coincidences, and if QAnon chooses the word cabal to describe a deep state conspiracy, I would argue that is because of anti-Semitic codes. Now, and other examples for anti-Semitic codes in QAnon narratives would be their constant references to George Soros and Rothschilds. I have already mentioned these two figures. Very often you will see in QAnon content that the Rothschild family or George Soros are portrayed as the puppeteers who are pulling the strings behind the so-called liberal establishment. You can see a joke or an image on the right side where the author argues that the real president of the US is not the 17th the 7 years old Biden, but the 89 years old George Soros. And if that wouldn't be enough, you can see Soros portrayed as the puppeteer behind Biden, and you can even see the strings. It's a very good graphic. It's a very good illustration because there is not much to misunderstand there. And another example we can see in the QAnon tweets and various social media platforms is the allegation that there is a group of Hollywood elites or liberal elites or democratic elites hunting and harvesting tortured children. Very often you will find the allegation that these celebrities or politicians would engage in various satanic rituals while they are torturing the children in order to gain an elixir or some kind of special liquid that will make them live longer. I do believe that this narrative is a continuation of the traditional anti-Semitic legend of Jews killing Christian children, also known as the blood libel narratives. Very often the Hollywood elites, the content or the QAnon narrative speak about are Jewish, not always, but the codes and the process they describe do remind one of these blood libel legends. And I just want to point to the 2019 attack on the synagogue in Poway, where the terrorist who did kill a woman in that synagogue actually did refer to blood libel allegations, which goes back to what Sabina said before, that these legends and narratives can be really violent, and no matter how old-fashioned they are in their conception. And I think that's actually a very good point, because the attack on Poway or Halle or Pittsburgh, these are not the exceptions to the rule. There is a growing number of far-right extremists in the US, but also in Europe, who are making real-world decisions based on social media conspiracy myths, or conspiracy myths that are also spread on social media. And very often we do not realize the connection between these terrorist attacks and the content that these terrorists did share or view or reproduce in their manifestos or social media platforms, which is also the reason that I think that this book is so important, that we make the wider public aware of these mechanisms and processes and create a wider awareness of the problem of anti-Semitism on social media, and hopefully can also contribute to a greater awareness of anti-Semitism on social media among the providers of social media. So that's all I had to say today. I really look forward to the conversation later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Armin, and yeah, thank you to Sabina and Monica for inviting me to this webinar, and thank you for the Wiener Holocaust.
Your audio is a bit shaky. I wonder if there's something you can do.
Is it better now? Is it still?
I don't know if it's try maybe without the headphone. Yeah, that's much better.
That's much better. All right.
Better.
For some reason, my headset seemed to have made my sound worse with this. Precisely the opposite of how it should work. Well, thank you again for having me, and thank you so much for the Wiener Holocaust Library for hosting us. I'll be speaking about a chapter that I contributed to the volume. As was mentioned already, the volume covers a huge variety of topics, and so the connection between QAnon and anti-Semitism within the Labour Party is maybe not perfectly obvious, but I think somewhat depressingly that really shows you how many different manifestations of anti-Semitism there are, especially in the online sphere. So my name's Jacob. I work for a think tank called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. The ISD has been, we are researching different extremist movements And sorry, I'm just waiting for my slides to proceed, and they're doing it somewhat slowly. Right, perhaps I'll just stop slide sharing and just speak about, quickly give the presentation, because it seemed to have some issue with the application of that. So again, we're a think tank. We're based in London, though we have a bunch of offices in different countries and research different extremist movements and forms of hate. Have done an increasing amount of anti-Semitism across the ideological spectrum, from Holocaust denial, from anti-Semitism across Islamist movements. And we thought it was quite important to also kind of cover the full spectrum of anti-Semitic manifestations, and therefore we're quite happy that I had the opportunity to contribute this chapter on far-left anti-Semitism and how it manifested in the Labour Party over the past years online in particular. Just as the background, because I, of course, don't quite know if everyone on the call is from the UK. If so, please forgive me. I mean, the background will be more known to people who were based in the UK over the past decade or half decade. But I mean, anti-Semitism on the left in principle may appear a little bit counterintuitive, because opposition to racism, support for equality of all human beings, is normally one of the core tenets of left-wing movements. But I think, as we know from kind of the history of socialist movements and states, there has always been a very unfortunate temptation to engage in anti-Semitic tropes, reproduce anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's a huge amount of anti-Semitic propaganda coming from the Soviet Union. And so there has been precedents for these kind of debates, even though they, in the UK context, became particularly heated over the past years. And so in the Corbyn era, and specifically, so from 2015 onwards, when he was elected as the leader of the Labour Party and of the opposition, people were pretty early on flagging concerning remarks and what they perceived as tolerance for anti-Semitic individuals and or movements, either by him directly or by aides and close supporters. These debates really became quite heated, went on for several years, and ended in an investigation by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK against the Labour Party. And in 2019, the EHRC actually found the Labour Party guilty of unlawful acts of harassment and discrimination over anti-Semitism within the party. And while a lot of this transpired in the offline sphere, like social media dynamics were often quite key. There was a lot of harassment of Labour Party supporters who were critical of Corbyn or of the leadership's handling of the crisis. And so while the social media dynamics were not everything about this crisis, some of the nastiest manifestations were certainly seen online. And so really my interest for this chapter was to kind of give an assessment, look at one of the most popular platforms, Facebook, look at Labour Party pages and pro-Labour pages like Momentum, and see what is the kind of discourse that you can find there. I had a list that I collated based on a past project that we had of about 40 Labour Party pages on Facebook, with a big diversity of how many followers they had. Some of them had followers in the hundreds, some of them had followers in the millions. And through a social media analysis tool called CrowdTangle, I was sort of able to access the data from these party pages. This is all public data. I didn't get any sort of privileged access to anything. This is all very much in the public domain. I then used this social media analysis tool to filter for discussions that's relevant to Jews in Israel. So I had about 65 keywords that really kind of identified all the posts in which such terms like Jews, like Judaism, like Israel were mentioned. And so arrived at a data set of about 1,000 posts over this the period of the Corbyn era. I really wasn't only interested in the posts themselves, because the CrowdTangle unfortunately limits the access to the data that you can get. You can't really look at the comments. You really only get systematic access to the posts themselves. And since I was quite interested in the kind of how the followers were discussing these themes, I really felt like I needed to look at the comment sections themselves and kind of get some slightly less systematic impressions there. But what I did is I essentially drew a randomized sample of about 100 posts and then just went through all of the comment sections associated with these posts by party pages, with the aim of identifying are there anti-Semitic posts, are there anti-Semitic comments, and if yes, what kind of anti-Semitism is this? Was this Holocaust denial? Was it comparisons between Israel and the Nazis? Was it allegations that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the countries in which they may be based? And so the whole range of kind of different manifestations of anti-Semitism. There's some caveats to this. Again, posts or comments could have been deleted in hindsight, they could have been moderated, they could have been edited. And so I probably really have access to the tip of the iceberg rather than the full spectrum of how anti-Semitism manifested in these spaces. My results, kind of in more quantitative terms, was that actually the party posts themselves, so the kind of like official statements, really none of them fell under the kind of international, the IRA definition that had been accepted by the UK government, but that in the comment sections, you actually saw quite a lot of this. In over half, 56% of the comment sections, you saw at least one, and in many cases, in the majority of cases, in fact, more than one anti-Semitic comment. And only about 40% or so were like challenged by other users. So often the stuff seemed to quite have been tolerated. And really, I think what I sort of took away from this is the impression that it's a nuanced picture, really. I mean, the total volume of anti-Semitic comments compared to what was discussed overall was relatively small. However, it was very, very frequent. It was in almost every comment section. So it's quite unlikely that people could have been active members of these communities walking away with the impression that this isn't a problem among supporters of the party. And again, as I said, it wasn't always challenged. It was, in fact, in the majority of cases, these kind of anti-Semitic comments were not challenged. Therefore, I think it's quite obvious why the critics of the party's handling of anti-Semitism would have walked away with the impression that there's a false tolerance towards these kind of attitudes and the people that express them. In kind of qualitative terms, and just to cite a few examples, I mean, the most frequent type of anti-Semitism that was found in these spaces, it was less the kind of content that you would find in neo-Nazi spaces, you know, like overt dehumanization of Jews, calls for violence, calls for another Holocaust or so. But what we saw quite a lot is conspiracy myths, allegation that Jews control the media, that they staged the Ghouta gas attack by the Assad regime in Syria, that Jews were responsible for the transatlantic slave trade, conspiracy theories about the Zionists or the Rothschilds controlling the media. You found quite a lot of comparisons between Israeli policy and that of the Nazis. You found quite a lot of posts that denied Jewish people the right to self-determination, often consciously, I believe, citing the specific text in the IRA definition to say that Israel is a de facto endeavor. So it wasn't that they were unaware of the definition, they were specifically trying to make the point and drawing on that example. But so it was a kind of mix. A lot of these posts were at least indirectly related to Zionism, to Israeli policy, but it went much beyond that. I mean, you found posts that said stuff like, if you dare to speak out against the Jews, then you're screwed. And Jews are responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. And so it really, really goes quite a bit beyond sort of what is often suggested in the discussions around left-wing anti-Semitism, that this is merely about Israel, that this is merely about Zionism, which of course doesn't automatically mean that there aren't anti-Semitic ways to criticize Israel or to attack Israel in ways that reference anti-Semitic tropes. But I think it's quite clear that it goes really beyond just the type of anti-Semitism that's related to Israel and Zionism. And I think I will sort of conclude at this point to leave some time for the questions. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion with the other panelists, as well as to the questions from the audience.
Hi.
Yeah. Oh, you're here twice, I think.
Yeah.
but maybe we can see if there are questions. Feel free to post a question in the chat if you have a question. Wait for Barbara to solve her audio.
Right,
There
hello.
you are.
Sorry about that. I've been trying to get my computer to work because that would be more straightforward, but it hasn't entirely succeeded. So I'm still here on my phone as well as on my computer, but it won't let me switch my video on. Anyway, thank you all so much. It was just, you know, such huge amount of ground covered, and all very interesting and thought-provoking, but unfortunately all quite disturbing, I suppose, as well. So yes, if anyone in the audience has a question, if you could put that in the chat. I can see there's a couple there, so we'll come to them in a moment. But I suppose I just had a question to start things off, which is that a question of what would you like to see governments do in relation to social media companies to try and get more change on about these issues? Because I mean, it just seems kind of frightening that such hateful and destructive material is proliferating in this way. It seems a threat to, you know, Jews obviously, but democracy, society in a way. So I don't know who would want to take that question.
Monica, you want to start?
Yes. So, I mean, recently, I think in cooperation with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, right, Jakob? The UNESCO, it was, published a guideline also concerning on anti-Semitism on social media and on messengers. And they brought something to the table which when we started working on the book and we're reading research, me and Sabine, we find very important. And I think in the report from the UNESCO and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, it's called now I lost it. Anyway, Sabine and I called it social media literacy. Digital literacy, I think it's called. We really believe that when people understand what, for instance, I try to explain how the technology works and how we come to see what we see on social media, people can make informed decisions. That's the one thing. And the second thing that I really would see governments to do, and my hope is very small that this will actually happen, is to take the social media companies to hold them responsible for what's happening. And that is really not happening at all. It is happening on such a tiny scale that it's really very frustrating when you're working in the field, considering that, for instance, Islamophobic hate speech has been found to have played like on Facebook has played a crucial role in the genocide violence. So this is already what has happened. So I do believe in digital citizenship, but this will not be enough, I believe.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think the responsibility of the platforms is absolutely crucial. I'm going to put a link in the chat. We did an event with the World Jewish Congress where we actually had a representative from Meta/Facebook defend the company. And but I mean, what strikes me is these are multi-billion-dollar companies, and they're using a pittance of resources to try to contain this issue. And I think the best chance of actually getting them to become more active and to use more resources is governmental regulations. There needs to be a push for that. And I think what Monica said is really important. If people join forces, if we build alliances like the one that Armin has built in in Berlin. If we work together with groups who are being discriminated against and who are targeted and join forces, I think then there's there's a critical mass that can make a difference, and I think that's going to be a part of the solution.
Yes, thank you. So we have a question which is directed at Monica, which I suppose is about the link between kind of Trump promoting, these ideas of calling COVID-19 Kung flu, and obviously trying to sort of have people associate it with China and so on, and ideas like Jew flu. Is there any sort of link between Trump's rhetoric there and then this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, would you say? You're muted.
No, I also just gave that as an example. I didn't research this. This is just really an example that very easily comes up when you are on social media watching stuff on the corona pandemic, and when you are more drawn to believing that this might not be real or the government might not speak the truth about it, then you very easily get to such content. I have not compared that to anything or have done any research on it. Jakob, maybe, do you have more knowledge about this? I remember a report from the ISP.
I think not directly on this example. I mean, we sort of tried to trace quite a lot of the tropes that we pushed around COVID-19 in general: disinformation, conspiracy theories, targeting of minority groups, and so you certainly saw some of the stuff that Trump was saying about it being like the Chinese virus, and so that this sort of was repurposed into racist caricatures. And obviously there was a huge amount of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, not just in the English-speaking social media landscape, but also in France and in Germany, where we did some work on the kind of proliferation of conspiracy theories and scapegoating of Jews for COVID-19. And so that definitely turned into quite a big thing, even though I don't quite know if there's a direct connection with that specific Trump phrase.
Okay, thank you. And we've got just a comment from Bruce pointing out that in some places the kind of social media monitors are, often have very long hours, limited training, poor pay, little if no psychological support for the very traumatic and just, repugnant things that they have to view. So that's a good point and another area to be looked at. Unfortunately, because of my technological problems tonight, I can't actually see if I think there was one question earlier on that I now can't see in the chat. I don't know if Sabina, you can see. I think there might have been a question quite near the start, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Yes,
Helen,
I think there was.
There's no other questions, so that's fine. Right, fine.
There's a new question which is quite interesting. I don't know if you see it, Barbara. Shall I read it out?
Yes, go for it.
So Sandra Resnick asked, thank you for the presentations. Thinking about the basic business model of social media, the whole idea of algorithms amplifying these tropes, do you have thoughts on how to move the media platforms away from the current algorithms? Well, that's a really interesting question, and it's not easy to answer because there was a case of Facebook where Facebook had because of a court decision, changed the algorithm. It was about Facebook taking part of discriminating against Black people. So that there were, I believe it was that they were not shown certain advertising for certain neighborhoods. So this became a white neighborhood because basically Black people were not shown this advertisement on purpose per algorithm. And they had to change that algorithm, and that created so much chaos and so many problems that I don't know, this is right now in the news and then don't really know how to solve it. I'm not sure if that is really the solution, because it's not only the algorithms, right? It's the whole business model. It's the whole concept. Social media, if you read Yaron Lanier, which I suggest you all do, you understand that social media was built with the help of behavior scientists, right? This is a very thought through model. And this is also why it's creating so much revenue. It's really very thought through. And I'm not sure if and how and to what extent that is actually possible to not create more issues. Jakob, do you have anything to say on that? You look very critical to what I say.
No, I was actually reading another question that was just posted in the chat by Claire. And so I think I was just trying to think very hard to come up with a good answer to that. No, I think to the algorithm question though, maybe first. I mean, our position has always been that the transparency around it is really critical. I mean, this applies to a few things in relation to social media platforms. It's the kind of, these are giant companies with vast resources that have an immense responsibility for the contemporary media ecosystems, and they essentially function like black boxes. They function like black boxes in terms of like what kind of data they make accessible, what kind of tools they make available, how these tools work. I mean, I mentioned that I used this social media tool, CrowdTangle. There's a lot of reporting that access to researchers might be revoked. Access to data used to be much more open on Facebook many years back, and before they revoked the access to the comment section. So they're sort of insulating themselves from scrutiny, and the same is true of the algorithms. And it's almost less about them publishing the exact algorithm, because I think many of us wouldn't be able to read one if we saw it, but it's almost more like, what's the outcomes, what's the dynamics, what's the biases that they present, and how does that affect? There needs to be some kind of democratic control over this in an area that's so sensitive to public discourse.
Thank you, Jakob. So yes, this question from Claire, how do you have any thoughts, any of you, about how to identify less overt anti-Semitism and more coded discourse on social media, which is of course harder to identify, easier to deny, and so on. So any thoughts about that?
Yes, we also have a chapter on that. I think chapter 3, where about tertiary anti-Semitism, because tertiary anti-Semitism is exactly these coded forms. How to identify it, that very much depends on I don't know, I would say the audience, right? It's very hard for us as researchers. We actually developed a code system which we hope other researchers would use and would be able to identify easier than it was for us. For us, it was really hard. And you have to imagine, we did it like this. We had a social media post, and then, or several social media posts, and then we were annotating it with whatever we saw, and we did it in like 4 or 5 rounds. And usually because it's so coded, right, the really vicious meaning hit us at the 5th time or something. That happened to us so many times when we were really sitting back and were really shocked, and sometimes really fighting tears, because we could not believe that in this case a German person would really think or say something like this after the Shoah. And it's on social media, and I think the coded forms might be much more widespread and much more normalized, because nobody's contesting them, right? Because they're so hard to detect. And I read a comment by Emanuela, she is saying that she is devoting her free time on fighting anti-Semitism on social media. So what I would recommend you can do instead of that, which you need to take a break of, is if there, for instance, are Jewish institutions or Jewish people being attacked, instead of fighting the attacker, write a post of solidarity to the attacked one. Whether this is, I don't know, a Jewish community or a person or because this is really a drop in the ocean. And I would also not, which I'm not sure how you do it. There are several places also in the UK, I think Jakob would know even better about that, where you can report anti-Semitism also on social media. I think one place is the Community Trust.
Community Security Trust, yeah, CST.
Exactly, which is a place exactly, yes, where you can report such content. And yeah, but anyway, thank you very much for caring. It's very important that people care and connect with us and talk to us and also share their experience with us, because we are the people who are also talking to the policymakers. And only if, like Sabine said, only if we work together, we can really tackle this challenging issue.
I just wanted to add one more thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is education. Of course, we're all educators, and you know, as Armin's piece showed, this has a long history, and so we do know a lot about that history, and I think it's really key that we do a lot more about educating people, young people especially, about social media and the uses of these algorithms, but also about anti-Semitism and other forms of hate and discrimination, and you know, make them sensitize them so that they actually can detect or refrain from, and also support people when they are being attacked and so on.
Yes, thank you for that, Sabina. I think we've just about run out of time, unfortunately. So just remains for me to say thank you so much to all of you for presenting the book, for telling us more about the information in the book. And I hope that people will be buying it and finding out more. It's obviously of kind of vital importance at the moment. And, you know, also, you know, you've talked about how you'd like to see it as the kind of founding of a new discipline in a way. And so I very much hope so, and hope that the Wiener Holocaust Library can support you with this. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Hope to see you at future Wiener Holocaust Library events. If you're specifically interested in the subject of anti-Semitism, we've got we've had other events in our event series about that subject, and you can have a look on our YouTube channel, and you'll find recordings of some of those there. So yes, thanks everybody. Apologies that I've had a few technological problems. It's just about worked, I think. So see you all again. we're going to end the event shortly. So good night.
Thank you very much, Barbara.